reverse Trump's rollbacks of 100 public health and environmental rules, and then forge a path to greater ambition. We're going to get back into the Paris Agreement, back into the business of leading the world.
As Joe Biden continues to forge ahead in the polls, he promises to strengthen democracy at home and restore American leadership in the world. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. With less than 4 months until the US presidential election, and with former Vice President Joe Biden continuing to extend his lead in the polls over President Donald Trump, the Democratic Presumptive Nominee has vowed to undo President Trump's decision earlier this month to formally withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization, saying, quote, "Americans are safer when America is engaged in strengthening global health. On my first day as president, I will rejoin the WHO and restore our leadership on the world stage." As the US continues to face new daily record-setting cases of COVID-19, the State Department has released a new report by the Commission on Unalienable Rights, tasked with reviewing US human rights policy. Critics of the report on Capitol Hill said it would damage the US's reputation as a champion of human rights around the world by narrowing the scope of who deserves protection. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, defended the report, saying, "Never before had America's founding principles been under such relentless assault. Freedom has always been at the center of American diplomacy. Since 1948, presidents of both parties have insisted that the United States must champion human rights abroad." Meanwhile, in the most recent survey by Pew Research, a nonpartisan think tank, on how the rest of the world views the United States, Trump ratings remain low, while views of the United States stay mostly favorable. Across Europe, 3 in 4 lack confidence in Trump's leadership in countries such as Germany, Sweden, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. In Mexico, nearly 90% do not have confidence in the US president. For an in-depth look at America's standing around the world, I'm joined by Tom Shannon, who was acting Secretary of State in early 2017 and is a 35-year career diplomat. Ambassador Shannon, when Joe Biden made his first foreign policy speech during the campaign, he pledged to convene a summit for democracy, in which he said he would focus on fighting corruption, defending against authoritarianism, and advancing human rights. Will this be enough to restore America's credibility and standing around the world?
It will be an important start. And what he did in that speech is effectively lay out the pathway whereby the United States will re-engage with the world. And by focusing on democracy, fighting corruption, fighting authoritarianism, and looking to promote prosperity and peace, he's indicating that in his presidency, the United States will be an active and important player in the global scene.
But can a Biden presidency undo 4 years of isolationism?
The power of the United States and the presence of the United States still exists. And I believe that the next president of the United States has to find a way to take that power and presence and make it meaningful again. Meaningful for American citizens, for the well-being of our great republic, but also for the way in which the United States engages with the world. Now, of course, there's no going back. It's really a question about what kind of future we move towards. But I think the vice president has made clear where he wants to go.
Well, we could still move towards a second Trump term, of course. Hillary Clinton has been criticizing President Trump, saying that he has pursued a very inconsistent and incoherent foreign policy. What would another Trump term mean for the United States' foreign policy interests?
I think it would mean more of what we've seen so far, which is a United States that steps away from global affairs, that focuses very intently and closely on its own national interests and domestic interests, and that understands its engagement globally only in terms of our benefit and our protection, and not about the creation of a larger global commons. And so should the president be reelected, and this is a decision that will be left to the American people, I think the past 4 years have indicated very clearly what the next 4 years would look like.
And here's what a former colleague of yours at the State Department, Ambassador William Burns, wrote recently in The Atlantic. He says, "This moment screams for leadership to help forge a sense of order, an organizer to help navigate this complicated mess of challenges, stabilize geopolitical competition, and ensure at least some modest protections of global public goods. But now we are living through the worst intersection of man and moment in American history. America first really means Trump first, America alone, and Americans on their own. The United States must choose from three broad strategic approaches: retrenchment, restoration, and reinvention." So can the US really recast its foreign policy priorities under a new presidency?
It can, but it won't be easy, obviously, because the world will not change just because of a presidential election in the United States. Whoever is the president on January 21st of next year will face the same challenges as the president on January 19th. But having said that, there is, as I noted, an important opportunity to re-engage with the world and do so in a meaningful way that benefits the United States and our partners. And I think Bill Burns, who aside from being a good friend is also a great American diplomat, has said it very eloquently in his article.
But it will take time to re-engage, won't it? I mean, you worked at the State Department for 35 years. The Trump administration has decimated the State Department. In fact, there are close to 30 top-level positions that are still unfilled. How concerning is this for you?
Well, very concerning, and not just in the Department of State, but elsewhere in the United States government, especially in the national security agencies. And so there will be a rebuilding of sorts, bureaucratically and in terms of expertise. But there's plenty of people to move into those jobs and assignments. I don't think that's going to be the primary challenge. I think in many ways, the big challenge is going to be, first of all, reassuring our allies and partners that we're back in the game and back for good. But secondly, helping the American people understand the world we live in today and helping build a new consensus around America's purpose in the world.
And helping as well, many might argue, build a new consensus and a new leadership role for the United States at a time of crisis in order to confront the pandemic that the whole world faces. Friends and foes are looking on with confusion, bewilderment, in some cases pity, and in other cases sheer concern. I mean, this is what a former presidential candidate, Pete Buttigieg, and former White House Special Assistant Philip Gordon wrote in Foreign Policy. They say, in the midst of the kind of global crisis that would usually lead much of the world to look to Washington for leadership, the chair normally reserved for the United States was empty. The failure of the administration of US President Donald Trump to build an international coalition to combat the coronavirus is in fact only the latest manifestation of a deeper and potentially lasting failure. They go on to say his America First doctrine, with its ominous echoes of the 1930s and indifference to the rule of law at home and abroad, have left allies wondering if they can count on the United States. Many have started to look elsewhere for more reliable friends and partners.
A powerful indictment. I will let them know they will not find more reliable friends and partners the way the world is structured right now, which is why the role of the United States is so important. And why.
But haven't many already turned toward China and Russia to fill that kind of vacuum?
And I think they will find that they're not reliable partners over time. I would argue that the United States has played a very special role over the last several decades and can continue to play that role in a way that our engagement is shaped not only building around common interests, but around common values, which the Chinese cannot claim.
But many can claim that the United States, Ambassador Shannon, has not shown a lot of consistency or reliability when it has actually moved away from so many agreements and multilateral institutions.
In some instances, that's true, and that's regrettable. And it's something that's going to have to be addressed by the next president of the United States to show that when we do make an agreement, we mean it, and that it's an agreement not just between governments, but between states. And in this regard, there's still a lot of work to do.
So when we look at the agreement that the United States was party to, the Iran nuclear agreement, is it salvageable at all? Do you see a Biden presidency rejoining this agreement, rejoining the other members of the international community?
Well, we still have many months to go before a change in administration, and a lot depends on what happens between now and then. I would hope that it's an agreement that we can return to.
What about the other priorities that Biden has spoken about? He says he wants to end forever wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East. He wants to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord on day one. He wants to elevate diplomacy and rebuild a modern, agile State Department, re-enter the Iran deal if Tehran returns to compliance, work with allies and other countries, including China, toward a denuclearized North Korea. He also wants to end support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. It's a long to-do list. Just how feasible, how realistic is this, and what should be top of his list?
Well, first, it's all going to be hard work and not easy. But the important thing is that he's laid out a very clear agenda with very clear issues that he wants to engage on, which, as I noted earlier, shows that the United States will be back. Will be back in an important way in the world should Joe Biden become president of the United States. In terms of priorities, these are not exclusive issues. And the United States is capable of dealing with all of them in a similar time frame. But they are not easy problems. The issue of Yemen in particular, it's one of the most brutal and awful humanitarian crises we see, entirely generated by fighting in Yemen and then between a Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis in Yemen. And efforts by the UN and others to attempt to bring peace and end these conflicts have failed. And so there's no magical solution, but committing ourselves to this solution, committing ourselves to processes and institutions that will promote solutions to this problem are what is needed at this time.
But again, when it comes to foreign policy, many would argue that there isn't so much a president can do without the US Congress going along as well. When it comes to the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia or Israel, two of your strongest allies, how likely is a Biden administration to change the way the United States has done business with these two countries so far?
Well, they're both important allies, strategic allies in the Middle East. And so I think the purpose of a Biden administration, and I do not speak for the vice president, but I would anticipate that the vice president's foreign policy team would find a way to ensure that we can maintain the strategic and important component of those relationships while dealing with the complicated nature of the relationships in both instances. And in this regard, it's really about ensuring that partnership benefits us all in this process.
You talk about the partnership, and of course there's also that traditional, very strong bipartisan support within Congress for the United States' oldest, longest, strongest ally in the Middle East, Israel. But earlier this month, a few senators, including Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, put forward an amendment that would condition U.S. military aid for Israel amid the ongoing talk about the possibility of an annexation of parts of the West Bank. Is that even remotely possible, given the strong bipartisan support for Israel?
Listen, the United States is not going to abandon Israel on the security side. But the annexation question is an important one and a very worrisome one. And I think in this regard, the role of the Congress will be important because the Congress is a sounding board. It is an expression of the American people for how they understand not national politics and international politics. And in this regard, a close dialogue between the president and the Congress ensures a close dialogue between the president and the people of the United States.
Ambassador Tom Shannon, great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ghida. It was a pleasure.
Meanwhile, while President Trump campaigned in 2016 on pulling U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, the Pentagon says that it plans to reduce the number of U.S. troops in these countries, but will maintain American support for local forces in the region. The U.S. currently has 8,600 troops in Afghanistan, 5,000 in Iraq, and around 500 in Syria. One of the stated aims of keeping US troops in the region, according to the head of Central Command, General Kenneth McKenzie, is to keep Iran in check, which he says has the clear aspirational role of ejecting the United States from the region. This while the fallout from a recent American intelligence assessment that Russia paid bounties to the Taliban to attack US troops in Afghanistan continues. Let's put these issues in focus with Admiral William Fallon, former head of the US Central Command, CENTCOM, and former Pacific Command commander. Admiral Fallon, the US is still engaged in its longest war, Afghanistan. The US troop levels have gone down from 12,000 to 8,600. And in accordance with the agreement that the US signed with the Taliban earlier this year, US troops would withdraw within 14 months altogether. Do you see this agreement being implemented? Do you see US troops leaving Afghanistan altogether?
Well, I think it's clear that the agreement is being implemented. It remains to be seen how this actually plays out after many, many years of conflict and strife and certainly lack of trust on both sides. I think we'll just have to see. But it's very clear that the U.S. Major combat role is long since finished, and we're moving towards a time when hopefully the government of Afghanistan can find its legs and be strong enough to actually act as the governing body of the entire country.
What do you make of these recent intelligence reports that suggest that Russia paid bounties to Taliban fighters to kill US and coalition troops? Just how credible are these reports?
Well, I think this is a mountain being made out of a molehill, but in terms of interest, the Russians are very interested. This is Central Asia. This is very close to their back door. Remember, it wasn't many years ago that all of the countries to the north of Afghanistan were part of the old USSR. Russia still has very, very significant interest in each of these areas, and this has been a battleground for many centuries here. The great struggles between nations that want to have influence.
What do you say to those, Admiral Fallon, who say that the United States, in fact, may have done far worse than the Russians have in Afghanistan by paying bounties to the Taliban, if in fact they did, that they did far worse by funding, training, arming the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden to topple the Soviet government in '89, and you know the rest of the story as well.
Absolutely disagree. That's a bunch of bunk. So having spent a lot of time personally in Afghanistan and having been the commander over there for a couple of years, I think that we did a significant amount of work to improve the conditions in that country for the people. And first and foremost, I'd point out the education improvements that have been made, the health improvements, many things that have really gone to improve the day-to-day existence of the people in the country. So I absolutely reject the idea that we're quote, worse than the Russians, or it's a bunch of bunk.
Are we getting to the end, though, of the American military presence in the region? There have been people who've been saying for years that we are approaching the post-American era in the Middle East. The United States still has troops in Iraq and in Syria. As a former CENTCOM commander, do you believe that U.S. military presence is sustainable, and for how long?
So again, we're in a different understanding, I believe, in terms of U.S. presence. Again, I'll restate that in my view of things, the U.S. should never walk away and be absent. We ought to be engaged at some level, not with combat troops, but with a presence to assist these countries and to try to help in the stability of the region.
Even if the U.S. isn't about to leave the region completely, isn't the reality that the United States is being squeezed out in the region? Just look at the recent strategic agreement that's being signed by Tehran and Beijing. Isn't that testament to the fact that it is slowly being squeezed out?
No, absolutely not. Don't agree. That's an interpretation I reject. So there's a lot of political activity going on, international as well as domestic. And in my view, this is two autocracies that are trying to help each other to continue to exist. So Iran's in a bad spot economically. They're looking for help, and China has ostensibly offered them some, but in terms of squeeze out, I don't buy it at all. Who's going to squeeze us? I mean,
if you look at the new emerging alliance between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, from a strictly military perspective, would you agree, though, that the United States today may be paying for what some people view as the biggest blunder, which was the Trump administration's decision 2 years ago to pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement, which then pushed Iran into the orbits of Russia and China?
The Iranians have had a foot in orbits, many orbits, for a long time. I absolutely reject the idea of some kind of military alliance between China and Russia and Iran. Highly doubtful for lots of reasons, and so I think this is it's a lot of talk. So, it seems that every year there was the quote biggest blunder. So the biggest blunder was 20 years ago with Bush in Iraq, and then the biggest blunder was whatever in Afghanistan, and whatever now. So, this is rhetoric.
But you say it's a lot of talk and it's a lot of rhetoric, but the maximum pressure policy, quote unquote, that the US has pursued towards Iran hasn't worked, has it? It hasn't stopped countries from dealing with Iran. Just look at the China and Iran deal that is reportedly being signed, a 25-year, $400 billion economic and security agreement. This will include infrastructure investments, as well as cooperation on defense and intelligence, and purportedly discounted Iranian oil and gas.
We've heard this all before. I mean, look at the numbers. Chinese have made deals, supposed deals, with countries around the world. As the countries examine these, quote, deals and find out the details, they're a heck of a lot less optimistic about, again, the talk that started these things. So I think most of it's just rhetoric.
Looking also at the growing geopolitical influence of China, you have many Republicans here on Capitol Hill, and the Trump campaign itself have been taking on a very aggressive stance toward the Chinese. The National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, said this just a few days ago. He says the days of American passivity and naivety regarding the People's Republic of China are over. America, under President Trump's leadership, has finally awoken to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party's actions and the threat they pose to our great way of life. Is China the US's biggest geopolitical competitor? Is it an adversary? Is it an enemy? Or is this all inconsequential electioneering?
Well, it's not inconsequential. And given my background and spending years in the Asia Pacific area and specifically dealing with China and the Chinese leadership, I said many years ago, despite the continual activity and our seeming inability to get out of the Middle East, that a much bigger issue for the U.S. was the relationship with China. That was the case 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and it's even more so today. Now, the problem that I see, and it's pretty discouraging, is that we seem to be in a political one-upsmanship contest here in Washington, where both parties take every opportunity to vilify the Chinese for everything large, small, and whether it's military, economic, or anything else. At the end of the day, it seems to me that we are going to have to figure out how we, China and the U.S., are going to coexist in this world of ours, because it's entirely interconnected, interwoven, and there's some nonsensical comments that have come out about how we're going to suddenly disengage or somehow apart and have no relationship, kind of like the Cold War days with the Soviets. That's not going to happen. This is a much different era. It isn't the same as the Cold War. And I think we need to be cautious about how much of a vilification process is ongoing and painting this as the number one enemy in the world.
Admiral Fallon, thank you so much for joining us. Great to hear your insights.
Hey, a pleasure to see you again.
So while foreign policy is unlikely to feature as a major topic in the next presidential election, it seldom does in the US, foreign policy will always be a critical aspect of any administration. For the next tenant of the White House, Trump or Biden, The disastrous economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic and its devastating death toll, 145,000 and counting, will be at the top of the agenda. But for a country that continues to pride itself as the sole superpower, its economic strength, its technological prowess, and its military potency have seen better days. And slowly this reality is starting to be understood by some Americans. And it is worrying the US intelligentsia. The lack of vision, of steady foreign policy, of standing on the international stage has undoubtedly eroded the US aura of invincibility over the past few years. And there is little doubt that the growing leadership vacuum has been steadily but surely filled by China and Russia. And so in short, if the pandemic has laid bare the fragility of economies the world over, for the US, it has done more than that. It has sped its decline and undermined its prestige. Whether it will be a Trump or a Biden presidency, both men know that if domestic policies have candidates elected, it is foreign policy which makes history. And these days, it is foreign policy which allows an American president to enter the pantheon of great presidents. That's it from me, but do let us know what you think. For now, though, from me and the team here in Washington, thanks for watching.